Hey everyone, my name is Jason Lenny, and I'm a product manager for release here at GitLab. And I'm joined by Mark Punsack, who's our head of product. And we wanted to talk a little bit today about the way that we manage maturity here at GitLab and a little bit of guidance for our product managers.
In this case, we're talking about product maturity, not people
Product
maturity.
maturity, yeah, that's very good. Important distinction. In order to kick this off, I want to talk a little bit about how this came up. I've been working on a new team here helping out with our package stage where we have a few different categories that are at different levels of maturity. And so I was wondering, how as an organization do we make the right decisions around bringing new items to a minimal level of maturity, then capable and lovable, and how you kind of manage that as a portfolio within one of our stages. In order to make sure that everybody's on the same page, I wanted to share a little bit from our homepage that talks about what I'm talking about here. So here at GitLab, we organize around a number of different stages, which you can see here. So manage, plan, and create are different stages within the DevOps lifecycle that we have product managers aligned to. And then within each of these categories, or within each of these stages, we have a number of categories. So if we look at the release stage, for example, has continuous delivery, incremental rollout, release orchestration. These are all different capabilities that we deliver to our users. And each one of these has its own maturity level, so complete, minimal, or planned. And these map to, on our category maturity, a few different definitions here. So minimal is where we've introduced a first iteration. It's pretty basic, but it works. And it's where we can get early adopters involved and test our hypothesis and really iterate quickly on a new feature. Viable is where it's being used to solve real problems. Complete is where it's really just a complete solution that's out there in the marketplace able to compete. And lovable is an excellent experience that is really something special in the marketplace. Of course, this is, there's gray areas between all of these things as things mature, but this is kind of where we like to define things so that people have a good understanding of what the category is as they're considering adopting it. Do you have anything to add there, Mark?
No, I think that's pretty complete.
Great. So I'm gonna stop sharing this, but I'll paste these definitions into the video, but just so we can see each other as we chat. So Mark, a few questions for you. As you're thinking about a new stage or even a stage that's out there and there's new categories coming in, there's established ones, how do you balance between getting a bunch of categories up to a minimal level versus focusing on one, getting it up to lovable, and what are the things that you think about there?
Yeah, and it's a great question. It's one we struggle with here, certainly with new product managers that join, but even existing ones, and I've been here for 3 years now, and I still struggle with it sometimes too. There's value in both, and it's worth understanding the trade-offs. And some of the trade-offs are surprising, so it's worth diving in a little bit. I think there's tons of stuff written about sort of lean startup kind of philosophies and getting things to minimum viable products as quickly as possible, getting to product market fit. There's less about what do you do post getting to the viable part, but there is still a lot written about sort of like do one thing, do it really, really well before you then go on to another thing. Mm-hmm. And that's great. I mean, there's a lot of benefits to doing so. I mean, by focusing on, first going from minimal to viable, you can really, product market fit is really essential, right? There's no point in, as a company, certainly as a startup, having a bunch of minimal things that get no traction. Like that's obviously useless. So getting to a viable thing, getting some customers paying for it, getting some customers actually using it, solving real problems, that's really, really critical. But when you've got viable products, you've got product market fit for some core product and you're doing well revenue-wise, as a company, you've got product market fit. Question is then like, how do you expand beyond that? And again, traditionally, I would have said, do one thing, do it well, then do another thing, do it well, then do another thing, do it well. And we don't do that here. We do something very different. And there's some reasons, particularly that GitLab does this differently, but there's other things that aren't. I mean, there are things that would do that because we are open source, for example, and we can leverage a community And for example, by being able to do some breadth, you can get a bunch of ideas out there that people can then see with concrete feedback. And then the community can help actually flesh out. They can say, oh, well, this doesn't quite work for my use case. I'll make it work there. And that's something that's unique because we're open source or open core, that the people can contribute to that. And so that's one particular unique thing. But it's not the only unique thing. We also just have unique angles in terms of we have this really incredibly transparent roadmap, and we have this really ambitious roadmap. And we've specifically gone after this really, really large, like, complete DevOps lifecycle, these 10 stages you just talked about, and all the 40 categories under there. That is huge. And we just can't get there by doing like one thing, get it beautiful, then the next thing, get it beautiful. We just wouldn't get there in time. And so in order to move faster, we have to do this breadth first approach. It does mean that a lot of the categories are still at the minimal stage, or some are viable, whatever, but not really, you know, complete, not fully usable by the majority of people. But enough is that we've got some really great capabilities, and the core is there, and that's really usable and lovable. I mean, our CI/CD is lovable, our source code management is lovable. People literally tell us that they love it. But we're looking to add a whole bunch of other stuff. And so if we do it, you know, one bit at a time, it'd just be too slow. By doing it faster, we can do really, really breadth first, go after all this breadth, get something out there, then people can start to fill it in. But it's not just then the external people, it's also internally, like, and it's about like setting the vision and all these other things. If you talk about where you're going, people will have a certain understanding of where it is, but you put a feature out there and they're like, oh, you're serious about this. You meant that. Oh, you've got this. Even if it's a really, really tiny feature. Feature flags is a really good example. We launched that a few months back, and the first version of it, frankly, wasn't useful for anybody in a practical scenario. We iterated on it after a couple of releases. Now it's, you know, starting to get towards a viable state. But even as soon as we had that very first thing, I had people come to me and be like, I can't believe you have feature flags in there. That is amazing. Like, this is awesome. This is what I want. And it's like, then they know that it's not really usable yet, but we actually shipped it. But even though we've been talking about it for a year, like nobody said anything before then, as soon as we had a thing in there, people talked about it and they realized it was real. Externally, but then also internally, people realize like, oh, this is actually part of your bread. And then they can start envisioning like how to make it better, how to move on, whatever. Once it's there, they can get a lot more concrete with their feedback. And then when you can also see the next steps. And then it's like, once you can see these steps and they're more practical, it's like, actually, I can see how that would happen. And like, wow, in 3 months, we can actually make a really viable feature flag capability. And but until you ship the first thing, people are like, oh, that's like a year of work, or there are other companies doing this whole thing. Like, how could you do that with just a couple of engineers putting a little bit of time on? So everything is much more concrete by having this breadth thing. But if we just do breadth, it's definitely a problem too. So I'll actually just share my screen for a moment. We do have in our strategy part of the handbook, we talk about breadth over depth. And we do explain some of these reasons that I just explained there. But there is a link. I don't know if this will really help or not, but I put this, I did a personal blog post on this a long time ago on how we look at breadth first. It can't be breadth to the exclusion of depth. Like if you just did depth, right? You pick one thing and you just go, you keep iterating on it until you eventually hit, you know, this is an amazing product, and you move on. If you just did breadth though, and you just continue to iterate on the breadth, then like all your features would be completely useless, but you know, you have a ton of surface area. So we've got to do something else where like you start off with one feature and you do one iteration of it and you continue to iterate maybe until you get to a viable. But in the meantime, then you also do other things where you're doing minimal things there. So within one category, you need to continuously move it better over time. But don't wait until that's done for you to then move on to the next category. And then with us, the real challenge is just like, how far do you go? How quickly do you go? What's the angle of that line look like? Right. And like last year, we had a vision we wanted to convey out there. And so we really focused a lot on breadth. We added a ton of new categories, and we just got to a minimal stage. We now need to go back and actually mature some of those and get them to, you know, the viable stage, the viable maturity. But in the meantime, we've also said, well, here's 30 new categories we're introducing this year. So we don't stop. We never stop moving forward. We're always moving forward with breadth. Sid has this analogy about plowing a field for farming kind of thing. Like if you're in the tractor that's like tilling the soil and getting it all ready, we've got to go there and clear this out and like rip up all the weeds, rip up everything so that it's nice, fertile soil so that other people can come in and actually contribute the functionality. If you go down that path, like it's our job to sort of clear this path, make it available, define what's going in there, and then make it available for other people to contribute to. But at the same time, like if you imagine that, take that same analogy and you said, okay, well, we're in that tractor, we're just going to go and clear the field, and you can just go clear the fields for like 300 acres, and like the farmers are still working on the first acre. Like, yeah, that's kind of a waste, right? It's totally, because then also, you know, to stretch the analogy, in the meantime, the weeds are going to come back and you're going to have to retill that field because things change. So there is a certain thing, like we want to be ahead. We want to be ahead large enough that we have this huge surface area that lots of people can contribute to, lots of people can see where we're going, but not so far ahead that it's a complete waste. So it's not a practical answer to help you out, but it does mean that you need to look at constantly doing a little bit of new, but also a little bit of improvement. If it's 6 months since you've launched something and it's still at the minimum level and nobody's using it, well, then, you know, it probably is too long. Like we've probably gone too far. We haven't really done anything. You need to at least get to a point where then people are going to be like, oh, I'm going to try this and then I'm going to contribute to it. Yeah. And so you probably have to have a certain threshold before that happens. So then, you know, trying to get it to a viable state, you know, sometime, you know, certainly within 12 months, but even within 6 months, like that makes a lot of sense. We haven't always done that though. I mean, last year we were on a really big breadth push, and some of these categories are still probably 6 months out and we haven't gone back to them. Some of them are, some of them aren't. I'm also going to add that in addition to sort of this general thing, there are a few areas that we've specifically identified. So in our vision, presented back in September, identified 4 categories is not quite the right term because I don't map exactly to the categories you just showed, but 4 areas, you know, so CD is one of them, project management is another, and then value stream management is another, and then application security testing. Application security testing actually maps to several of our products because we've got static application security testing and dynamic application security testing. But as a bucket, the industry probably just really thinks of it as security testing. We've identified those 4 areas as deserving special attention, and we want to get those to be lovable. So some of them are pretty close already. Like project management's pretty good, but we still have a ways to go before we can really say it's a lovable project management for, you know, a large group of constituents. But some of them, like value stream management, didn't exist last year at all. We're introducing it and we expect to get it to lovable within a year. And so that just takes a lot of effort. So those are 4 areas that we really, really want to invest in. We really want to get those to be, you know, through the entire maturity cycle and get them to be lovable. And then of course, you know, there's still tons of others that we want to get there, but the others we're not aiming for that same level of maturity. So the same investment in depth. How's that sound, Jason?
It's really, really great. I really like the tilling soil metaphor there. That's and I like that it can be stretched so far.
I know, it's funny when you stretch things a little
too far. About silos, grain silos, and
true.
It's good stuff. I do have one follow-up question. It seems like the kind of that minimal to viable transition point is one of the most interesting ones because it's one where you're really thinking strategically about the product and how it's growing. What must be important there is engaging with the early adopters in a productive way to kind of find those initial collaborators. And then also reading signals in kind of a noisy environment. Do you have any experience or insight there that could help product managers be successful in that stage?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm going to go off on a tangent for a moment because we have a bunch of different sensing mechanisms as product managers. We can talk directly with customers. We can talk through sales and prospects. But we also, again, because we're open core, we have this public issue tracker where tons of people comment regularly. And one of the interesting things is if you follow sort of a lean startup model where you want to learn as quickly as possible and you want to get to viable as quickly as possible, then you are proactively managing that relationship. You're going out and finding the early adopters, you're talking with them constantly, showing them the next thing, ideally iterating like every day, showing them the next thing until you eventually get to viable. And that's great. But we have this huge breadth, and we have it's actually surprisingly efficient to say, look, we're going to launch a minimal thing, and then we're just going to let it sit. But because we have this open issue tracker, we have a whole bunch of people using the product, people will give us feedback, and people will tell us like what it takes to get to viable. But it's not fast. So it's one of these bandwidth versus latency kind of challenges. We have a huge bandwidth of feedback coming in, but the latency can be really quite high. And so one of the other benefits of doing this, till the soil in a lot of different places, is that we allow lots of people to contribute, but we just can't control when they're going to contribute. We can't control when they'll even give us feedback. And so it can take several months before somebody then contributes. I remember we shipped Container Registry a long time ago. And there was this one feature that a lot of people wanted, and we didn't ship it right away for a variety of reasons, because we had a viable thing. It was viable pretty early on, but there were some things that people wanted to do. Anyway, it took about a year, but eventually the community did contribute this. And it was by that point, like a lot of people had wanted it. But there was a lag. And, and maybe, if you want to look at it pessimistically, you could say, oh, well, they finally got frustrated that we didn't do it. They eventually picked it up. But you could look very optimistically and say, well, this is something that they wanted, they cared about personally. And so when it hit some threshold of, oh, I really, really want this, they just figured out how to do it and made it happen. A similar thing then kind of happens with the minimal stuff, right? You throw something out there, it takes a while before somebody naturally stumbles upon it, and then they'll try it out and then be like, well, this doesn't work. And a whole bunch of people will just ignore it, but some of the people will get vocal, and eventually you'll get some feedback, and then you'll have a better idea of what went viable. So it's just really efficient in a total amount of effort perspective, but it's not necessarily from a time perspective. So as a product manager, one of the interesting strategies you need to figure out is like, how time sensitive are you to these things? Like if we were still, again, we were starting trying to figure out our first product market fit, it'd be a whole different story. Like you need to get there as soon as possible. But we have a great product that's selling very well. And we're talking about adding surface area that individually doesn't directly contribute to revenue. Like we don't charge for individual categories, but it all becomes a stickiness thing. It all becomes value add, and all just, is really, customer happiness and all that kind of stuff. So how quickly do you need to do that? And that's why it's important for us to identify, like, these are the categories where we believe it does matter. There's like competitive pressure, or there's just, we have sense that these really matter a lot to our customers. So we're going to proactively do the, try to work down the latency, try to get it out faster. Whereas some of these other ones, maybe it doesn't matter as much, and we can rely on the bandwidth factor and say, okay, latency it's going to take longer to get there, but we're going to be more efficient because of that. And it's a struggle because efficiency is clearly one of our values. And so the bandwidth versus latency thing is a really interesting trade-off. We do rely a lot more on bandwidth than latency. We don't swarm on something to get it done faster. We do a lot of things. We ship a lot of volume every release, but we don't necessarily say that any individual feature is going to get there within 2 releases or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's really interesting. I think we're out of time, but it's been really, really great information. And I think this kind of context can help a lot of people out who are thinking about, their categories and how to solve these problems. So thank you very much, Mark. It's a very nice conversation.
All right. Thanks, Jason.